There is a moment this story wants to begin with, and it is not the beginning. It is a July morning in 1887, when the whole dust-bitten county of Calhoun had gone 61 days without a true rain, and a young woman named Vera Pratt stood at the edge of a wide, shallow depression in the earth, a place the old maps called a blue hole, though it had been years since anyone had seen water in it. And she was watching 58 hogs drink, not sip, not nose cautiously at mud, drink with the full, greedy, architectural devotion of creatures who had been thirsty for a very long time and had found, at last, the one place in 40 miles of cracked pan and brittle grass where the water still came up cold and clear and reliable from a limestone seam 20 feet below the surface. The sound was enormous and ridiculous and beautiful, a sound like a river being invented. Vera did not smile exactly. She was not a woman who spent smiles carelessly, but she stood with her arms at her sides and her hands rough as bark and her boots dark with good mud, and she looked at the 58 hogs drinking in the only wet place left in Calhoun County, and she permitted herself to count. She always counted. Counting was how she prayed. 58 barrows, all of them healthy, all of them fat, all of them hers, paid for at a total cost, deed and transport included, of $24.30. 3 years earlier, she had paid it. 3 years earlier, she had been 22 years old, recently alone, and the owner of 120 acres of the ugliest land in the county. 3 years earlier, the whole town of Greer's Mill had agreed, without a formal vote but with complete unanimity, that Vera Pratt had finally lost what little sense she was reputed to have. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. This is not a cruel habit exactly, and it is only a human one. The town of Greer's Mill was full of perfectly ordinary people who had learned, as most people do, to measure worth by what they could already see. What they could see was this: a young woman alone on scorned land, counting a few dozen dollars into the palm of a man selling sick hogs nobody else would buy. What they could not yet see was everything else. 3 years earlier, then. The land had come to Vera through her Uncle Clement, who had spent most of his life acquiring things nobody wanted and dying before he could prove their value. The 120 acres in the northwest corner of the county were his masterwork of uselessness, a long rectangle of pale limestone outcrop and thin hardpan, and one broad, bold depression that even in good years only held a skim of standing water in the wet season. In a dry year, it was just a pale scar in the earth, cracked at the edges and smelling faintly of old mineral and disappointment. The neighbors to the north ran good black soil corn ground. The neighbors to the east had a creek. Vera Pratt had a blue hole and 119 acres of the rest of it, and the deed to both had come to her in a plain envelope the week after Clement's funeral, along with a note in his cramped hand that said only, "The low ground knows something the high ground doesn't. Ask it." She had read the note 4 times. Then she had folded it into her coat pocket and walked the land in November, alone, in a wind that smelled like tin and snow coming, and she had looked at everything very carefully, the way she looked at most things, which was the way a person looks when they intend to understand a thing rather than merely see it. What she understood by the time the light went, and she walked back to the rented room above the feed store in Greer's Mill, was that her uncle had not left her a disaster. He had left her a question. The question was, what does the low ground know? She did not know the answer yet, but she had learned in 22 years of being practical and poor and largely on her own that questions were more valuable than answers you hadn't earned. She kept the land, and she took a job at Harriet Boone's kitchen, washing and hauling and doing the rough work, and she saved. The town watched her save and considered it further evidence of something. Most people in Greer's Mill believed that Vera Pratt was patient to a fault that bordered on stubbornness, which was true, and proud past the point of good sense, which was also true, and that she had inherited a waste of ground that would drain her dry before she was 30. This last part they were less sure of, but they said it with confidence, because confidence is free and the alternative, admitting they did not know, cost something. The specific person in Greer's mill who said it loudest was a man named Dale Cutter, who ran the county's largest grain brokerage from a 2-story building on the mill road, and who had, upon Clement Pratt's death, offered Vera $40 for the whole 120 acres, and been told no in a tone she had not needed to raise. Dale Cutter was a man built for prosperity, broad, ruddy, well-fed, his boots always clean in a county where boots were never clean, and he had a particular quality of condescension that he wore the way other men wore good hats, as a sign of having arrived. He had wanted Clement Pratt's land for the limestone under it. He had not told Vera this. He had told her it was an act of generosity on his part, offering $40 for ground that wasn't worth $20, and that a young woman alone couldn't manage a place like that anyway, and that she ought to think hard before sentiment cost her money she didn't have. Vera had thought hard. She had thought hard enough to walk away from the $40 and the advice both. Cutter watched her go with the particular expression of a man who has been contradicted by someone he does not consider qualified to contradict him. He did not forget it. By the time spring came that first year, Vera had moved from the room above the feed store onto the land, into a 2-room house that she built herself with second-hand lumber and considerable bad language, and the occasional reluctant assistance of an old man named Augustin Vere, who farmed the 40 acres east of her ground, and who had been in Calhoun County since before the county had a name. Augustin was from the old country, somewhere in the German hill country that he described with great precision whenever the topic arose, and almost never otherwise. He was 71 years old and small and weathered to the color of a fence post, and he had a way of arriving at a moment of difficulty with tools already in his hands, as if difficulty had a schedule he kept track of. He had watched Vera measuring and cutting and swearing at the lumber in weather that was still touched with frost, and on the 3rd day he had appeared at the edge of her property line with a draw knife and a level and no explanation. She had looked at him. He had looked at her. "My name is Augustin," he said. "You build the way your uncle did. He could not frame a corner to save his life either." "I know," Vera said. "He left me notes." "He left everyone notes. He left me a note about my fence. He was correct about the fence." Augustin set down his level. "The ground here is unusual." "I know," she said again. "You do not know yet," he said, not unkindly, "but you will look until you do. That I can see." He picked up the level again. "Your corner is 4 degrees off." That was the beginning of the friendship, which was not a soft thing. Neither of them was built for softness, but was instead a reliable thing, the kind that shows up with tools and doesn't require much explanation. It was Augustin who told her about the hogs. He told her in May, when the framing was done and the roof was on, and Vera was sitting on the step in the evening light, doing what she always did in the evening, which was calculate. She was calculating what she had and what she needed, and how far apart those two numbers were, and the distance was significant. "You have low ground," Augustin said, arriving as he did, without announcement. He settled onto an upturned crate. "Low ground is a gift that looks like a curse." "My uncle said the low ground knows something." "Your uncle was a peculiar man, but he was not wrong about ground." Augustine looked out at the blue hole in the fading light. "Water comes to low ground. It has to. It has no choice. And where water comes, things will grow that will not grow elsewhere. What do you plan to plant?" Vera had been planning to plant a kitchen garden and 20 acres of winter wheat. She said so. Augustin nodded slowly, the way he nodded at information that was true but incomplete. Wheat will grow, not well, on this ground. The high pan will crack before August, and the thin soil will not hold moisture from the hole to the field, he considered. But do you know what will grow very well on wet low ground and hard pan and the rough grass between? She waited. Hogs, he said. It was not, on its face, a remarkable observation. Hogs were common in Calhoun County. Half the farms kept a pig or two, but Augustin was not talking about a pig or two. The Decatur Road has a yard, he said. A slaughter contractor, a man named Briggs, took on a drove of 46 Barrows and 12 more sows from a drover who could not pay his feed bill. The drover let them go thin, and the contractor does not want them thin. He sells by the pound and has no patience for a long feeding. He will take almost nothing for them. Augustine looked at her. Barrows will do on rough grazing. They root, and they find what you cannot see to plant. On low ground with good water, on the grass and the mast from the scrub oak at the north end. They will get fat without much help. And when the county comes to slaughter time in fall, fat Barrows on the hoof bring real money. Vera sat with this for a long while. Then she did the arithmetic. She had $41.20 in a tin under the floorboards. $24.30 would buy the 58 Barrows and one load of freight on the Decatur Road to bring them to her gate. That would leave her $16.90, which was enough to last the summer if she kept her kitchen work 3 days a week at Harriet's. The hogs would go on the land in June. By October, they would be ready. If she got $5 a hundredweight, and the current price was between $4.50 and $5.50, depending on the buyer, and if the hogs fattened to a reasonable slaughter weight of $2.40 or better, she was looking at income that would change her arithmetic permanently. If the water held, if the mast was sufficient, if she could keep them from going through the fence line. If was a large word. She lived in it the way you live in weather, not because you chose it, but because it was the condition you were operating under. She paid Dale Cutter's competitor, a freight man named Elias Shorn, the $24.30 on a Wednesday morning. The hogs arrived Friday. They were, as advertised, a sorry sight, ribby and dull-coated and suspicious of the light, blinking out of the freight car onto the Greer's Mill platform with the general air of creatures who had given up expecting anything. The town of Greer's Mill came, as towns do, to look. There were perhaps 30 people at the platform that Friday, plus 4 or 5 children who had no agenda beyond the spectacle of it, and the consensus that traveled through the gathering was immediate and unkind: sick hogs on bad land. A waste of what little money the Pratt woman had managed to save. Someone said that Clement's peculiarity was in the blood. Someone else said it more plainly. Dale Cutter himself was not present, but his opinion was represented by a man named Fowler Briggs, who worked at the brokerage, and who told 2 or 3 people near him that he would give Vera's operation until the first frost before she was selling the land to meet her debts. Vera heard most of this. She stood at the gate of the freight pen, and she looked at each hog in turn, counting, which she had already done by correspondence, but which she would not feel certain of until she had done it herself. 58. All alive. Thin. Yes. Sick was the wrong word. They were hungry and travel-worn, which are conditions that land and water and time can fix. Sick is something else. She had looked at enough animals to know the difference. She did not say this to the crowd. Being right is its own kind of reply, but only if you are willing to wait for it. She got the hogs moving and walked them the 1.5 miles to her gate, alone, which took most of the afternoon and required a creativity of effort she would not have predicted from the map. One of the children from the platform, a girl of about 9 named Calame Pruitt, who had no family in the immediate vicinity of the incident, and therefore no one to call her away, had simply fallen in beside Vera somewhere on the Greer's Mill Road and had not left. She was a quiet child with bare feet and a practical expression, and she turned out to be better at managing the outside wing of a loose hog than most adults Vera could name. By the time they reached the gate, Vera had not said much, and Calumet had said less, but there was an understanding between them of the kind that does not require ceremony. The girl came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The hogs went through the gate and across the rough ground and down the long slope toward the blue hole, and when the first of them reached the edge and smelled the water, limestone cold and clean below the skin of dry mud at the margin, the whole drove went in like one creature. The sound of it carried. Vera stood at the top of the slope and counted again. 58. The work that followed was not glamorous, and it was not fast. Vera was up before light every morning to walk the perimeter of the rough board fence she and Augustin had put in along the property boundaries, because a fence that will hold cattle will not necessarily hold a hog with opinions, and these hogs had been in a freight car for 2 days and had opinions in abundance. She patched and reinforced and drove stakes and cut brush, and by the end of the second week the fence held and the hogs had settled into the rhythms of the land. They rooted. This was what hogs did, and on Vera's ground the rooting turned out to be a revelation. The scrub and rough grass of the upper pan was lousy with grubs and roots and the fibrous native plants that the thin soil grew abundantly, and the hogs moved through it like slow, thorough machines, turning the ground as they went. Along the lower slope, where the moisture seeped up from the limestone seam, the grass was thicker and sweeter, and the hogs grew visibly from week to week, their ribs disappearing under new flesh, their coats brightening. Calumet named them. This was not something Vera had anticipated or especially sanctioned, but it turned out to be functionally irrelevant to the operation, and quietly delightful, in a way Vera declined to admit to anyone. The names were improvisational and occasionally theological. There was a general, a pharaoh, an October, a twice, and at least 7 variations on the name Big, and Calumet kept track of them with a system that nobody else fully understood, but that she applied with complete confidence. When Vera needed to know which animals were tracking fastest for weight, she asked Calumet, who would say something like, "Pharaoh is moving, but October has Pharaoh beat by a good inch across the back," and she would be right. Augustin came by twice a week, always with some piece of useful knowledge, and occasionally with food. He had a way of setting a pot of something on the step and departing before Vera could object to being fed, which she would have, because she was stubborn about debts. She repaid him in labor, fence work, harvest help in September, and they both pretended this was a business arrangement rather than what it was. In July, Augustin stood at the edge of the blue hole and looked at the sky with the particular kind of attention he gave to weather, which was not the attention of a man estimating a picnic, but the attention of a man reading a text in a language he had spoken for 70 years. "No rain by August," he said. "The almanac says otherwise," Vera told him. "The almanac," Augustin said with a courtesy that did not conceal his opinion of the almanac, "has not been watching this sky." She looked at him. "How long dry?" "Longer than is comfortable," he said. "Maybe longer than that." He looked at the hole, at the faint shimmer of its surface. "But the water in the hole, that is not sky water, that is stone water. It does not care what the sky does. Your uncle understood this. It is why he kept the low ground." He paused. "Your neighbors do not have stone water." She took this in the way she took everything important, quietly and without immediate response, banking it like a coal low under ash. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned the color of old bone and stayed that way. The creek on the east side of Vera's property dropped to its bed by the second week. The corn on the high black ground to the north fired at the edge by the third week and was half dead by the end of the month. The dust rose from the roads in the morning and stayed in the air until long past noon. Vera's blue hole held. The limestone seam fed it steadily from below. indifferent to the sky, cold and clear as it had been in June. The hogs drank. The lower grass, fed by the seep, stayed green along the margin. The hogs had grown so much from their June arrival that Calumet reported that Big Number 4, who had been the runtiest of the Barrows at the platform, was now the third heaviest by her reckoning, and she had the notched stick to prove it. The town of Greer's Mill was not doing as well. The drought of 1887 is in the county record, though the record understates it, as records tend to do with suffering. 61 days without meaningful rain. Half the corn crop in Calhoun County failed outright. A quarter of the small hog operations in the county lost animals to heat and thirst when their ponds dried and their creek water dropped to nothing. The price of feed grain, which you needed if your animals had no pasture, went to a figure that made grown men sit down quietly in their barns and look at their boots. Dale Cutter did very well in August. He bought grain from the South at his usual prices and sold it in Calhoun County at August prices, and the difference between those two numbers was a distance that satisfied him deeply. What he had not planned for was October. October was when the slaughter buyers came to Greer's Mill. They came every year out of Decatur and Springfield, and one house out of Chicago that sent a young man named Fitch, who wore city clothes and had opinions about marbling and grade that the county's farmers found either impressive or annoying, depending on their confidence in their own product. Fitch arrived in the second week of October. He had been to 4 farms by the time he came to Vera Pratt's gate, and what he had found at those 4 farms was animals that were either dead or visibly reduced by a summer of drought and short pasture, or animals that the farmers had kept alive on expensive drought-bought grain and therefore had to price high to recover their costs, too high for Fitch's scale. He came down Vera's gate road in his city boots, already writing the trip off, and then he stopped. The hogs were in the lower field, spread across the green strip along the Blue Hole's margin, and they were extraordinary. Not one of them below 220 on the hoof, and the best of them, October, Pharaoh, and a sow Calumet had named the Senator, for reasons she never fully explained, were pushing 260, fat-marbled and deep-shouldered, and in the condition that only animals on good grass and clean water achieve. Fitch stood at the fence for a long time. Then he came to the door. Vera had been expecting him, or someone like him. She had the numbers ready, her numbers, not a prayer, but arithmetic done a dozen times in the dark by lamplight until she was certain of them. She offered Fitch coffee. He accepted. Calumet, who was becoming difficult to keep out of significant conversations, positioned herself near the window. Fitch said his company would take the lot. He named a price. It was a fair price by the standard of a normal year. Vera looked at him and said that it was a fair price by the standard of a normal year, and that this was not a normal year, and that there were 58 animals averaging close to 240 on the hoof, and the only animals in comparable condition in the county were hers. He said his company had a scale. She said she had Calumet. He looked at the child, who looked back at him with the patience of someone who has been managing hogs since early summer and is not easily unsettled by a man in clean boots. Fitch named a higher price. They went back and forth 4 times, which was 2 times more than Fitch usually went, and they settled at a number that made the arithmetic Vera had done in June look cautious. $5.40 per hundredweight, on 58 head, averaging 238 pounds, on the scale Fitch had brought on a wagon. The final sum came to $747.11, paid in bank draft, which Vera accepted without visible emotion, folded once, and put in her coat pocket, where for 3 years she had kept her uncle's note. She thought about this, briefly. She thought about the note and the draft both living in the same pocket for a moment, the question and its answer. Then she went back inside to do the arithmetic again, because she needed to be sure. $747 was enough to pay the remaining debt on the land, purchase a proper winter's worth of supply, invest in breeding stock for the following year, and still leave a reserve that would see her through a second bad summer, if one came. It was not wealth exactly, but it was security, which in 1887, in a drought year in Calhoun County, was a more useful thing than wealth. It was not a secret she could keep for long. Fitch's wagon spent 3 days on Vera's property while the hogs were sorted and weighed and driven to the freight cars at the Greer's Mill platform, and the town watched this with an attention it had not paid to Vera's operation since the June Friday it had found her original purchase worthy of ridicule. The attention was different now. It had the quality of a room in which people have just realized they misread the weather. Dale Cutter heard the per hundredweight price on the first day. He heard it from Fowler Briggs, who had heard it from the freight man, and the number had the effect on Cutter that real numbers always have on men who have been operating on false assumptions. It arrived like a step that isn't there. By the second day, Cutter had done his own arithmetic. He understood now what the blue hole was. He understood that the limestone seam fed it independent of sky water, which meant it would hold in drought, which meant the land was not what he had called it when he offered $40 for it, and which meant that the limestone itself, which he had wanted for building stone, was less valuable than the water it produced. He arrived at Vera's gate on the afternoon of the second day on his clean-booted horse, with the expression of a man who has prepared a reasonable case. He said he had reconsidered his earlier offer. He said the land had shown more promise than he had appreciated, and that he was prepared to be generous. He named a figure. Vera listened to the figure. Then she asked him, in a tone of genuine curiosity, how he had arrived at the acreage count. He had said 90 acres. The deed said 120. Cutter paused. He adjusted. He said he had misspoken. She said she reckoned he had. And then she said the land was not for sale at any figure he was likely to name, and thanked him for coming by, and went back to the hog lot. Cutter sat at the gate for a moment. Then he rode back toward the mill road, and his boots were, for the first time in recent memory, not quite as clean as he'd intended them to be. That might have been the end of the story, in the way that comfort and a bank draft can feel like an ending. But the Drought's last piece of arithmetic had not yet been settled. It was Augustin who came to her in the third week of October, after the buyers had gone and the hogs had been loaded and the lot was quiet for the first time since June. He came at dusk, and he sat on the upturned crate at her step, and he did not bring tools this time. He told her that the Gannett family, 3 farms north, good people, the father a quiet man named Roy who had never said an unkind word about Vera or anyone else, had lost their corn to the drought and most of their hog operation to thirst when their creek went dry, and that Roy Gannett had 3 children and a wife and a winter coming, that the numbers would not survive. Vera sat with this for a time. The county store in Greer's Mill, which was also the informal exchange where farm surplus was bought and traded, was going to price hard this winter. The drought had cut supply, and the merchants knew it, and they were not, as a class, known for charity. She thought about Fitch's draft. She thought about what security felt like and what it required of a person once they had it. By the following Monday morning, she had done what needed doing. She had spoken to Roy Gannett, who had received the conversation with a dignity that cost him a great deal, and she had set a price on the feeder corn she had bought in August, when it was cheap, before Cutter and the other brokers marked it up, at the August price, not the October price. She set the same price for the Hendersons to the south, whose sow operation had taken hard losses. She told Harriet Boone at the kitchen, and Harriet told 3 people, and in the way of small towns, the offer was known to everyone who needed to know it before sundown. This was not charity. She was careful to call it what it was, a sale, a fair one, at a price she had paid and was willing to pass on. She was not wealthy enough for charity, and she thought charity a poor way to maintain the kind of relationship that a neighborhood requires for the long term. A fair price is a thing both parties can stand on. A gift creates an imbalance that the weather will eventually use against you. She knew this the way her uncle had known about the low ground, not because anyone told her, but because she had looked at it until she understood. The town of Greer's Mill did not reverse itself in a single dramatic gesture. That is not how towns work. What happened was more incremental and more real, a nod from Roy Gannett at the store that held something it hadn't held before. Harriet Boone telling a customer over lunch that the Pratt land had the only water that hadn't failed. 2 or 3 farmers at the mill road stopping to ask Vera questions about the limestone country to the northwest, and Vera answering them without condescension because she had not yet forgotten what it felt like to not know. Calumet came by the farm on the Saturday after the sale and found Vera walking the now empty lower field, looking at the blue hole in the October light. The child stood beside her, and they looked at the water together, cold and still, and fed from somewhere underground that the drought could not reach. After a while, Calumet said, "What are you going to do with it next year?" Vera said she was going to put 2 sows to a good boar over the winter, and come spring she would have breeding stock of her own and not need to buy a drove from a freight yard. "How many?" Calumet asked. Vera thought about the arithmetic. 80, she said. Maybe 100. Depends what the first litters look like. Calumet considered this. "I'll need more names," she said. "You'll have them," Vera told her. Augustin came by that evening. He did what he did, which was arrive with something useful. This time it was a piece of paper with information about a boar at a farm outside Decatur that had thrown excellent litters 2 years running. He set it on the step without ceremony. Vera made coffee. They sat in the failing light, looking at the low ground and the blue hole and the October sky above it, which was high and clear and still dry, but had, somewhere in the northwest, the particular gray edge of weather coming. She told Augustin what she had done about the corn price. He listened without surprise. "Your uncle would have done the same," he said finally. She thought about the note still in her coat pocket. "The low ground knows something the high ground doesn't." "What does the low ground know?" she asked, not because she didn't know any more, but because she wanted to hear him say it. Augustin looked at the blue hole a long while. "That what falls from the sky is not the only water," he said. "There is water that comes from depth, from stone. It does not depend on this year or last year or the goodwill of the season. It is older than any drought." He turned his cup in his hands. "The high ground waits for rain. The low ground already has what it needs. It only looks poor until you look closer." The rain came 3 days later, not enough to make up the season, but enough to settle the dust and green the brown margins and remind the county that the drought had an edge, and they had found it. Vera stood in it for a moment, a light, cold October rain, with her face up and her eyes closed. Then she went inside and did the arithmetic for the following year, and the numbers were good. What she built over the next 5 years on that 120 acres was not a grand operation by any measure that newspapers would have noted or Dale Cutter would have admired. It was something smaller and more durable, a hog farm that did not fail in drought years because it had water the drought could not reach. A place where the blue hole ran cold and clear through the dry seasons that came, as they always do, when the sky turned to bone and the creeks fell to their beds. A place where 2 sows became a breeding herd of 22, and the Gannett boy, who was 12 when the drought came and who grew into a competent and grateful young man, came to work 3 seasons running and learned everything Vera had learned. And Calumet grew into a young woman who could assess a hog's condition and a fence line's integrity with equal precision, and who, in 1893, bought her own parcel 1.5 miles to the west and asked Vera to come look at the low ground on it and tell her what she thought. What Vera thought was that it was good ground, low and wet and ugly to the eye that was looking for the wrong things. She said so. She said, The low ground knows something the high ground doesn't. Ask it, and be willing to work until you understand what it tells you. Calamé wrote it down. It was the same thing, nearly, that Clement Pratt had written in a cramped hand on a plain piece of paper and left for a 22-year-old woman who had nothing but patience and good arithmetic and the willingness to look at scorned things until she found what they were actually worth. Some lessons travel that way, not through schools or newspapers or the opinions of men in clean boots, but hand to hand, from someone who did the work to someone ready to do it next, passed along like a coal kept low under ash, still burning, waiting for the right air. That is how the low ground keeps its water. That is how the good knowledge keeps.